Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. Thank you so much. I hope all of the listeners out there are doing fantastic as well. I cannot wait for the listeners to hear the guest that we have on today. The way she tells this story is unbelievable. It really knocked my socks off. I was captivated. She has this cadence about telling a story, the way she goes about it, and she's so articulate. It draws you in, really pulls you into the fine details of this story, which are truly tragic. But Tim, what's truly tragic here is the fact that I don't know how you are, and I just keep going on and on. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, very excited to introduce this conversation with journalist and author Kayla Hounsell. And Kayla has written 2 books about a very similar subject, really the same subject, First Degree, and her new book is called Second Degree. It's because Taylor Samson was murdered by Will Sandeson, and in the first trial, he was given first-degree murder, and in the second trial, he was given second-degree murder. And Kayla covers this story, and as she describes in the interview, it's really the only person who could have written these books because of how closely she covered these cases. And Taylor Samson was murdered in 2015. So this is a story that's been developing for almost a decade now.
And both Sanderson and Samson were students at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And that's one of the most tragic parts of the story, is that you had these 2 young men who were seemingly on very promising paths. And then drugs came into the mix, and we had the situation that unfolded, which we're discussing in this interview. And we were introduced to Kayla through our very good friend, Jordan Bonaparte of the Nighttime Podcast. He did interview her a few times. They had some great conversations on this, and you can go to his podcast, Nighttime Podcast, and check out all of the conversations that he had with Kayla. And while you're doing that, just check out all the conversations and all the stories that he tells on that feed anyway, because he's great and the show's great.
Okay, so check out the book Second Degree, From Med School to Murder, the story behind the shocking Will Sandeson trials by Kayla Hounsell. Hope you enjoy this conversation and stay tuned till the end because we'll be back for some final thoughts at the end of the interview. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM.
All right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will be back with Kayla Hounsell speaking with us about the murder of Taylor Samson.
Welcome to the podcast, author Kayla Hounsell. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
We're doing excellent. We're so happy to have you on. You are a friend of a friend.
That's right. I'm so happy to be with you. Thanks for your interest.
Absolutely. You've covered this one particular story for the better part of a decade, and you're finally at a point where you're telling all of this. But the aforementioned friend is Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, and you and him have done numerous episodes together and have done an amazing job digging in to this story. But before we get to the heart of the matter here, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? Anyone out there who does not know who you are?
Yes, sure. So I am an author and a journalist. I write books on the side, I guess. In my day job, I'm a national or network reporter for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I cover the East Coast of Canada. And I've been a reporter now for almost 20 years. And as you said, I've been covering this one story for half of that time, basically.
Very cool. And what is your background?
I'm originally from Newfoundland, which is Canada's easternmost province, and I moved to the nation's capital, Ottawa, to attend Carleton University after I graduated high school, and I have a journalism degree.
Awesome. And when did you decide that was going to be your thing? Because people
That's a really good story, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
It's most people who know me well and know my work are very surprised by this story because I am very passionate about what I do. And so people think I had this lifelong passion to do this. And though I do now, it didn't really start out that way. You know, I was in high school in Gander, Newfoundland, small town girl. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, to tell you the truth, but I was always a bit of an overachiever, really studied hard. And I think I had overloaded my course load, and a guidance counselor said to me, "You're taking too many courses. You're going to bring down your overall average. You should take this media course, and it'll be an easy course." The teacher of that course knows this story now and is not quite happy about that. She said that, but that is why I signed up for the course. And that teacher, I really owe him a lot. He really saw something in me and said to me, "Hey, you could make this a career." And honestly, I don't even know if I really knew what journalism was at that age of 17. And I got to do some pretty cool interviews in that program and decided, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. My whole family moved halfway across the country for me to go to journalism school in Ottawa. And thankfully, I did fall in love with it and did get a true understanding of what it was. And it was the right thing for me.
How cool. Wow. What a supportive family. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate. They actually still live in Ottawa and they flew here to Halifax for the official launch of this book last night as well.
That's incredible. Okay, I do want to start talking about your books. So you're talking about the book Second Degree, which is the sequel to First Degree. Can you tell us about what went into your decision to start writing these books?
Yes. So it was back in 2015 when this case started. And I was covering it as a local news reporter at the time. And I had been there from the very early days. We'll get into the story, but it was started as a missing persons case. So, those typical cases, right? The family members are putting up missing persons posters around the city. I was just a local news reporter responding to that. And then fast forward a couple of years, we get into the trial. And at that time, live tweeting was really popular on Twitter, which is now known as X. And it was one of the first trials that really got a lot of attention on Twitter. And so people in this city kind of galvanized around that. And my publisher actually reached out to me. It wasn't my idea to write this book. The person who would go on to become the editor of the first book recognized the story she thought it should be a book, reached out to me, and that's how it came to me. But I knew immediately that it was a good idea and that it should be a book because there was so much of the story that was still untold. As a news reporter, and I was predominantly a television reporter at that time, so it's like you see it, the quick 2-minute stories. And also a lot of the story was under a publication ban at that time until the completion of the trial. So I couldn't tell the whole story in my job as a daily news reporter. And when the publication bans lifted, that's when I was able to tell the whole story in the book, which as a journalist is a very satisfying experience.
Cool. We're going to get to what the story is, and I was about to, but then you mentioned the publication ban, and that kind of piqued my interest a bit. How do you know when you're writing something? Are you given like guidelines? Like you can talk about this, but not this, and you can talk about this, but not this. Like how do you navigate through that?
So there are legal guidelines around what you can and can't report while a criminal matter is underway. And it is usually for the most part, until the completion of the trial. Of course, in this case, there are 2 trials, which we'll get into as well. And that is to protect the rights of the accused and to ensure that they get a fair trial. But when all is said and done and the verdicts have been delivered, then these are matters of public record. And so fair game.
Okay, good to know. So let's talk about what this story is that we keep alluding to.
It's a really terrible story. It's a deep tragedy that has affected many, many people in the part of the country that I live in Canada. It began, as I said, in 2015, August 2015. There's a missing person, a young person, 22 years old. He was a Dalhousie University physics student. And a couple of days later, another Dalhousie University student, a medical school student. So this is a person who is signing up to save lives, is charged with the first-degree murder of a classmate. Now, I should say in Canada, we have first-degree murder and second-degree murder, and the main difference between the two is that first-degree murder is planned and premeditated. And so he was convicted then in 2017 of first-degree murder. In 2020, the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal overturned the conviction. They said there was a problem With that first trial, the verdict did not stand. They ordered a new trial. That takes us up to 2023. He had another trial. This time he was convicted again, but only of second degree. So the second jury did not believe that he planned the murder. At least not all of them. It has to be unanimous. And that is the reason for the second book, the reason that I have updated my original work, because there was a different verdict. But the story of what was supposed to happen that night in August 15th, 2015, pardon me. They were going to do a drug deal. They didn't really know each other. They'd only met a couple of times, though attending the same university. It is a large university. And they were going to exchange 20 pounds of weed for $40,000. And Taylor Samson was the victim. He was seen walking into William Sandeson's apartment that night on surveillance video, his own surveillance video. He had cameras up outside of his apartment. And we don't see him leave. But we see the accused, William Sandeson, coming and going throughout the course of the evening, again the next morning. And there's an hour and a half where the surveillance video is shut off. And we now know, because in the second trial, William Sandeson took the stand to testify in his own defense. And he said during that hour and a half is when he removed Taylor Samson's body from his apartment.
And he shut off his own cameras when he was doing that. So he was very aware of what he was doing. What is the story about when this unfortunate victim went into the apartment? What transpired inside the apartment?
Well, I think the short answer is we'll never know. We have William Sandeson's version of events, and there were a couple of witnesses to the aftermath. So the reason that a second trial was granted is because there are these two witnesses. They became the trial's star witnesses. Their names are Justin Blades and Pukil McCabe. They were seen on surveillance video peering into William Sandeson's apartment that night. And for 18 months, they said they saw nothing. But the police never really believed that, because there's that shot of them on the surveillance video looking into the apartment, and one of their faces appears very shocked. So the police always thought they weren't really telling the full story. But for 18 months, they maintained, didn't see anything, don't know anything. Then there was a private investigator hired by the defense to go and interview these guys, lean on them, see what they might say on the stand. And by this time, these guys were feeling really badly about this, and they were scared. They didn't really know who all was involved in this. And so they wanted to talk. And they told the private investigator what they saw. They said they looked into that apartment that night. They saw William Sandeson, the killer, now convicted, running around in a panic. There was drugs all over the place. There was money all over the place. There was blood. The drugs and the money were in blood. And there was a man sitting on a chair, slumped over, with blood running out of his head. Now, they didn't know Taylor Samson, so they couldn't identify him. But they said there was a man who appeared to have been shot in the head. So that's their version of the aftermath, right? They're not witnesses to the murder. They're witnesses to the immediate aftermath. So that was the only version that was presented in my first book, First Degree. Then this is the reason for the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal overturning the conviction, because there was this private investigator who's hired by the defense, but he sort of goes rogue and effectively switches sides and tells the police, you got to talk to these guys again. And he says that he did that out of a moral obligation to do the right thing. But he was working for the other side. And all of this didn't become known until halfway through the first trial in front of the jury. So the defense in the first case was left scrambling to figure out how to deal with this. It was a very novel legal issue. There was a discussion about, is it the same as if his lawyer had done that? You know, does it breach solicitor-client privilege? It was determined, no, it didn't, because he was a private investigator. The defense asked for a mistrial. The judge did not grant it. The judge said, you know what, this is unfortunate. It's unfortunate the way it's come up midway through the first trial. It's left everybody scrambling, but it's still possible for him to have a fair trial. Let's proceed. But then the appeal court said no. There should have been a mistrial. There was no way to make a proper way forward in the middle of a trial like that. And that's the reason there was a second trial. Now, so to your question about what transpired inside, we learn from the accused himself in the second trial when he takes the stand in 4 days of incredible, sensational testimony. And he says that they gathered in his apartment that night to do the drug deal. And there was another guy, bear with me, this is a little bit confusing. There was another guy who had been robbed a couple of nights prior to that day, August 15th. And he felt that he thought the victim, Taylor Samson, had stolen from that guy, and that guy owed him money. So he felt he had a right to take this money from Taylor Samson. By the way, there is no evidence that that's true or that the victim was involved in that home invasion in any way. And he felt that he was never he said that he was never going to give him the $40,000 for the drug deal that they had agreed upon. And he said things got hostile quickly when Taylor Samson realized he didn't have the $40,000 to give him. And he says they jostled around the kitchen for a while, and that Taylor Samson lunged at him and that he pulled the trigger in self-defense. The second jury rejected that story and convicted him of second-degree murder.
I want to back up just a little bit to the actual drugs. You said it was 20 pounds of marijuana for $40,000. Is this something that is like a huge issue in that area? Were there a lot of drug dealers and a lot of drug deals happening in that area? That just feels like a lot of marijuana. And where was that coming from?
Yeah, there are some questions as to where it was coming from. He says that he drove back and forth to Quebec to get drugs, not specifically for this night, but just in his drug dealing. No, I don't think it's any more of a problem in this area than it is anywhere else. In fact, the police have said it's actually not that much weed. There was some question as to whether the Hells Angels were involved, if this was gang related. There were rumors about that. There's also no evidence to suggest that. But I think it does lend some insight perhaps into the university community and people dealing drugs to get by, to get extra cash, to get themselves through. That seems to be what both the victim and the accused were doing in this case. And I should say, this guy who's now convicted of this murder, I mentioned he was a medical student. He was just days away from starting medical school. He'd already completed 1 year of medical school outside of Canada. And he comes from a good family, a supportive family. His own words when he testified were that his childhood was idyllic. His parents have supported him and been present in court throughout. They have 3 other sons who are also intelligent, educated, varsity athletes. And he made a series of bad decisions, obviously. No one in his family had any idea that he was involved in this, drug world, and that he was moving large quantities of drugs and cash in doing so.
Did he say how he got involved in it in the first place?
He didn't, only that he had only been involved in it for a few months at this point, and that, he did it, to have some extra cash.
Wow. I mean, I could see where the temptation is to have some extra cash and feel like it's kind of a victimless crime to commit. It's marijuana, and most of it, like it's legal in most parts of the North America, right? I mean,
it's it's not legal to sell
right.
In Canada. It's legal to consume.
Correct. But I mean, when you're thinking about like it as being like he's not dealing like prescription medication or heroin or it's about as low level as it can get. But I'm just wondering, like, what's the monetary value to where he is now compared to like he needed some extra cash? Well, now you're in jail for murder.
Right. So he also had a significant amount of debt, which the Crown argued was the motive. The Crown is not required to prove motive, but they did argue that his motive was greed and that he was cash strapped. He had a $200,000 line of credit for medical school, which there was already $80,000 owing on at that point in August 2015, and he hadn't even started medical school yet. And his mother was a co-signer on that loan, and she was getting the statements. And we know this from text exchanges between he and his father, where his dad says, your mom got the statement, she's not happy. And he tells his dad, like, no worries, this will be paid off at the end of August. But he also talked about, and the people around him talked about when they testified, that this was going to be the end. And now, whether that's true or not, or whether that was true in his mind at that time, I don't know. But he was telling people that he was going to be done selling drugs. Certainly, his girlfriend at the time was very unhappy that he was doing that. She had no involvement in this. She wanted no part of it. She didn't want to see it. In fact, he had, asked her to leave that night to go to a friend's house. He told her because he was doing a drug deal, or she assumed it was that. And he told her, this is the end. And she was putting a lot of pressure on him, saying, you're starting medical school, you're going to lose, you could lose everything you've worked so hard for. And he said, yeah, that's it, I'm done. But of course, he never got to that point because he was arrested 3 days later, and he has been in prison ever since.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And how long did he sell drugs for?
This happened in August, and he said that he had only even tried drugs himself in January.
He tried selling them or tried consuming them?
He tried consuming them in January, and then he said it was a few months after that he started selling. He just kind of realized how easy it was, that he was just going to kind of be a middleman in between and make some money.
And were there any other kinds of drugs that he was selling or consuming? No?
Not to my knowledge.
Wow. And how well did he know the victim, Taylor?
Not at all. Really,
Not at all.
they'd been put in contact just a few days prior. They met on a couple of occasions to look at the drugs. He went to see a sample. And at first he said, that's not good enough. It's not a nice enough product. And Taylor went to see if he could get a better product and get the amount that he wanted. And so they met briefly on 2 occasions. There was another contact that had introduced the 2 of them, but they weren't friends. They had no relationship. They didn't know each other.
And so some kind of fight broke out in the apartment over the money, I guess.
That is his version of events, remember. And so not everyone believes that. There are people, certainly Taylor Samson's friends and family, say, no way. Even the words that he was saying, Taylor said to him, that was not in his character. He would not be saying those words. And the judge also, at the end, when the judge is considering the sentencing, I should also say that both first and second degree murder in Canada come with an automatic life sentence of 25 years. First degree is no chance of parole until 25 years. Second degree, the parole eligibility can span between 10 and 25 years, and it is up to the judge to decide. The jurors can weigh in and make recommendations. They do not have to be unanimous, and they don't all have to make recommendations, and the judge is to consider those recommendations. But ultimately, the decision belongs with the judge. And so, of course, he considers mitigating and aggravating factors when he does that. And in this case, he did say that an aggravating factor was that William Sandeson besmirched the victim's name. There was no evidence to suggest that he had been involved in this home invasion, or that there was any fight, or that his own life was at risk, as he was suggesting when he said that he killed him in self-defense. We also know, based on the time that we see him walk into the apartment on surveillance video and the time that these 2 witnesses to the aftermath look in, this is all time-stamped, right? So he was only in the apartment for 3 minutes before he was murdered. So there wasn't a lot of time for a lot of arguing and fighting to be happening.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about the family of the victim and how their reaction has been to the sentencing?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a terrible, terrible thing for them to have to deal with and to continually have to deal with, because this court matter keeps dragging on and on. I've had a chance to interview a number of members of Taylor Samson's friends and family. I have a particular, I would say, a more intimate relationship with his mother now after all of these 10 years. So, certainly the interviews that are in this book, Second Degree, are more intimate than in the first one, I think, because of the passage of time. And, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is that his body was never found, which makes it so much more difficult for his mother. They have no final resting place. She's never, I don't love the word closure. I don't know if you ever get closure from something like this, but if you think about it, when your loved one dies, you have a place that you can go to visit on their birthday or the anniversary of their death, and they don't have that. They have created a very simple plaque at Dalhousie University with his name on it, and they go there and visit there because that's the only place they have. And so that's at this point all that his mother wants. She desperately wants the remains, which obviously she's not going to get at this point. And with regard to the sentencing, they were obviously pleased with the conviction of first-degree murder, which meant no chance of parole for 25 years. And they are disappointed with the second verdict of second-degree murder. And so the parole eligibility, I mentioned, it spans from 10 to 25. In the end, the judge gave him 15, and he got credit for time served, which is very typical. So he'd already served half of that time. So, we're looking at 5 years from now, he begins being eligible for parole. And now that doesn't mean an automatic release. That means the Parole Board of Canada will hold a hearing. The family will have to go again. They will have to write statements, give statements, and it will be decided whether or not he can begin a release plan at that time. He is a model prisoner, which is another thing that makes this story so fascinating in my view. He's become incredibly educated in prison, getting a master's of business administration, a paralegal certificate, a security certificate. He's updated his physical training. He's learned multiple languages. He's making very good use of his time in prison. So all of that will work in his favor. It is, though, important in those parole board hearings, they consider remorse, guilt, acceptance of guilt. And he still has not done that in any meaningful way. He said, as a part of a sentencing report, that he hoped that his testifying in the second trial would bring the family relief, but he's never apologized to them, and he's had opportunity to do so.
And they haven't found the body, but he claimed that he dumped it in the Bay of Fundy, right?
That's right. The Bay of Fundy, known for the highest tides in the world. The water rushes in and rushes out, right, twice a day. And he grew up on the Bay of Fundy, and his family's property is very near there. And again, he says that he had no plan for this, but his version of events, which not everyone believes, is that he killed him that night. As I mentioned, he shut the surveillance cameras off for an hour and a half. He put the body in his trunk and went to bed. His girlfriend came home. They went to bed. The next morning, he drove his girlfriend and her friend to work with the body in the trunk, and then he just started driving. And he first stopped. He pulled off to one exit and went into a gas station and bought a couple of drinks and dumped in a bag with Taylor's phone. Taylor Samson's phone was never found. Obviously, that would have been a critical piece of evidence as well. And then he dumped that bag with the drinks in the phone in a garbage bin at the gas station and kept driving. He said somewhat kind of aimlessly. And he ended up driving to his parents' farm, which is about an hour 100 kilometers drive outside of Halifax, Nova Scotia's capital, which is where the murder took place. And so he went in the direction of the farm, not to the farm itself. The farm was searched heavily for multiple days in the very beginning, and much evidence was found there, but not the body. So he says he pulled off into sort of like a little gravel parking lot, and he walked with a bag, the bag that Taylor brought the drugs in. He says he put Taylor in that bag. Now, Taylor was 6'5", and the bag is 3 feet 6 inches. He says he put him in the bag and carried him to the dike heads. And I went there and drove the same route that he said he drove and walked the same steps that he said he walked. And I clocked it with my smartwatch, and it was 190 meters. So he had to walk 190 meters before he would be concealed by the dike heads. And this is a pretty popular area where people would be walking their dogs at that hour of the morning. So I think it's possible that he did what he said he did, but it would have been a fluke for no one to have seen him, or if they did see him, didn't think to say anything about it. The judge did find as fact that he dumped the body in the Bay of Fundy. So that was considered a fact by the court. The Crown asked the judge to find as fact that he dismembered the body, because of course there are questions about how can you fit a 6'5" body inside a bag that's 3 feet 6 inches long. And the judge said that he could not find that as fact because there was not enough evidence. There was no evidence really to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that was a fact. But that is why some people question his telling of events, because of the size of that bag and the size of that body.
Right. Wow. And so I obviously the bag never turned up either.
Yes, the bag was found.
It was.
Because once he got there, he took the body out of the bag and wrapped it in garbage bags. He said that he did that because he thought people wouldn't be so likely to kind of stop and look at garbage as they would if there was this bag. And so the bag was found on his parents' farm, and Taylor Samson's DNA was confirmed inside of it.
It's a gruesome concept to hold in your head. However, he was put in the bag and carried. But one thing that just occurred to me is the gun. Where did he get this gun? And doesn't him having a gun imply that this is premeditated? Because why would you have a gun other than maybe, protection, or you think something bad's going to happen? But how did that factor into the trial?
Well, you could certainly make that argument, but he has an answer for that as well. I mean, he was legally able to have the gun. He had a license for the gun, and he went to buy it in the previous summer. And he said that he took it to the gun range a few times. He took his girlfriend there for a date. Once, he said she had never handled a gun and they went to the gun range together. He said that he got it because the people that he was dealing drugs with in Quebec, I mentioned he said he was going back and forth to Quebec to get drugs. He said they wanted him to have a gun for protection. That was his story. He said that he only brought it to Quebec on one occasion and to the gun range twice. And other than that, it was never out of his safe. But the gun was found in his apartment in Halifax where the murder occurred, and Taylor Samson's DNA was also found on the gun.
Wow. So, yeah, the gun apparently made it out of the safe within those 3 minutes that Taylor was in the apartment.
He said that he had the gun tucked into the waist of his pants, and that he said he did this. He had no intention of using it, he said, again, his version, and that he had it there to intimidate him, because since he intended to confront him about this home invasion where he was essentially going to accuse him of stealing drugs and money from this other guy, he thought that it would maybe get hostile. And so he wanted to use it as a form of intimidation, to be able to be the stronger player in that fight if that were to happen. But he said he had no intention of using it. But he did say that he flashed it and showed him the gun when things started to get hostile and they were jostling around the kitchen. So he talks about how he was pinned against the table at one point, and he was holding the gun under the table to make sure that Taylor couldn't get his hands on it. But it's also worth pointing out that he's a tiny guy, and Taylor was a really big guy, 220 pounds, 6'5", as I said, and Will Sandeson, I think, is 5'10", and 120 pounds. And so one thing that Taylor Samson's mother said to me, this whole story that he was talking about them jostling for the gun around the kitchen, and she said, that was so dramatic, and there were all these theatrics involved. And she said, Taylor was this big guy. If he wanted the gun, he would have had the gun.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Were there forensics done inside the apartment on exactly how Taylor was shot? Like, did that tell us anything about premeditation?
It doesn't tell us anything about premeditation, but yes, there were forensics done. And so first of all, there was, blood and DNA confirmed basically all over that apartment. He cleaned up, but not very well. To the naked eye, it looked like it was cleaned up well. And certainly his girlfriend came back there 2 hours later and didn't, see anything out of place. It reeked like bleach. She testified to that. And then in terms of the forensics on the like the bullet itself was found in the window frame in the apartment. And there are analysts, of course, that can tell us about the position of where he was shot. So he was shot at close range, right? He shot him point blank.
Were they facing each other when he was shot at point blank range, or was it from behind?
Yes. I mean, again, there's some question about this, but he says that he shot him and he fell backwards into the chair that the other two witnesses saw him slumped over in, because he says the reason he pulled the trigger is that the victim lunged at him because he's telling this story about self-defense, remember? Um, you know.
And the witnesses said that he had blood coming out of his head?
That's right. And the other thing that we can take away from where he was shot exactly. So when he testified on the stand, he said he didn't know where he was shot. And he told this story about how he thought first maybe it was in the chest because he was hearing this sort of wheezing sound. But there is an interrogation video that is more than 9 hours long that was played for the jury in the first trial and not for the jury in the second trial. His second defense lawyer, a whole new defense team for the second trial, was able to get that interrogation video excluded. And this was really critical because during this interrogation, he does make reference to him being shot in the back of the head or the neck. It's a video, so you can actually see him touching the back of the head or the neck. But because that interrogation video was excluded, the second jury that convicted him of second degree didn't hear any of that information or all these other stories. He actually told multiple versions of events to police. And he's on video saying, everything from Taylor didn't show up that night. He didn't even see him. He doesn't know why he didn't show up or where he was instead or why he went missing, to these other two guys who he doesn't know came in through the front door and they hit him and he turtled on the ground and he didn't see what happened to Taylor. And then there's another version where there are not two guys, but there are three guys and they're wearing morph suits and they burst in through his roommate's bedroom window, not the front door. And they're the ones who take Taylor and they put him in the bag and he doesn't know whether he's dead or alive. So it's very, very critical that the second jury didn't have any of that information. And that is, of course, what paved the way for him to tell yet another story, which is this story about self-defense.
So why did they have that video excluded?
This is kind of getting into the legalese, but he had a very good lawyer in the second trial, and she made the argument that the police, all of his rights were not followed, basically. So you have a right when you are arrested to be informed of the nature of your arrest and to seek legal advice. He got both of those things. But if the circumstances change, you're supposed to be able to have that access again to legal advice. And he was asking, he's a really smart guy, remember, and he was asking throughout, I need to speak to my lawyer again. I need to speak to my lawyer again. When he was first arrested, he was arrested for kidnapping, trafficking, and misleading police. And that was the nature of the interrogation from the start. Eventually, he incriminates himself enough that the police say, and at the same time, of course, they're searching his apartment, they're getting the gun, they're starting to acquire this other evidence, and they get enough where they can charge him and arrest him for murder. But the judge ruled that the words that the police were using during their interrogation suggested that they were already looking at him for murder. They were talking about Taylor in the past tense, for example. And so the police said, no, like we thought he was still alive. And when his jeopardy changed, when we charged him with murder, that's when they let him talk to his lawyer again. And the judge said he needed to be able to talk to that lawyer far earlier in the evening, far earlier in those 9 hours. And because of that, he ruled that those interrogation videos were not admissible in the court of law.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's good lawyering, but something about the position of Taylor's body doesn't sound right. Slouched over a chair doesn't sound like that would maybe happen if he's facing the person who shot him. But can you tell us about the girlfriend, Will's girlfriend? I feel like she must have a lot of interesting information on that period of time before the murder and then afterwards.
Yes, I mean, she didn't do an interview with me, so I haven't ever talked to her. She declined to participate, but she testified in both trials. And, I really feel for her, actually. I think that this has impacted her life in a really significant way. She was actually studying commerce at the time and ended up going to law school and is now a practicing lawyer, which I think is an interesting turn of events. But yes, of course, she had information about the lead up to. She was actually arrested as well. She was arrested with him, but quickly released. She was arrested because she was with him, and there's never been any suggestion that she had any certainly no involvement, but also no knowledge of this. She knew about the drugs. She didn't like the drugs. He told her, "I'm getting out of it. I'm going to stop doing it." And she said that he tried to respect her, I guess, in that way, and didn't want her to see it. So this is why she didn't think it was that unusual to be asked to leave the apartment that night. So while all of this was happening, she was at her friend's house watching a movie, and she had texted and said, "I'm getting tired. Can I come home yet?" And he texted back and said, "Soon, not yet." And I mean, I guess the defense in the first trial made the point that she could have walked through the door at any moment. She was respecting him in not doing so, but she did. But says that was common. But she really didn't know more than that. Then she did see she has more information about the aftermath, those few days where he thinks he's getting away with murder and outsmarting the police before he's arrested. It's 3 days in between. She says that he told her there was a fight. She was asking about the bleach, right? Why is there so much bleach in the apartment? And he said there was a fight. A guy got sucker punched and there was some blood. And then the next day, of course, these missing persons posters begin appearing around Halifax, and they're being shared on social media, Facebook at the time. And she sent him a picture and said, "Oh, is this the guy? I hope he's okay." And he said, "No, it's not him. Don't know that guy." And that was the end of that, right? She also talked about how he was really sweaty that night. And he testified that he had actually already showered when she came home, but she made him shower again. And she said, like, they went to bed together and she had her head on his chest. And she testified that he was sweaty and that his heart was racing. But she didn't, she went to sleep.
How different was Will? Did she testify or make mention of that other than I guess his heart beating? Was he acting any differently?
Not really. She said that he had been a little bit off, but she also said that he had been off that day. They'd been together that day. They'd actually gone out for supper together. They'd gone back to his apartment and they watched Netflix for a little while before she went out. So she had said that he was off, but that was all really.
I mean, it's got to be such a shock for someone like that. How long was their relationship before this happened?
That's a good question. I do have that information. I can't recall off the top of my head. I think it was I want to say a year. They'd been together for some time, like they knew each other.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at all of the people involved here, they're not the people that you expect to be dragged through the justice system. And I've spent a lot of time in court in my previous job. That's what I did. I covered court and crime, and you see some sad situations in court. And this is not that. I mean, all of these people, many of them, not just the victim and the accused, and most of them through no fault of their own, were got tangled up in this, having to testify. The girlfriends of both of them, their friends, witnesses, and they were all like young, attractive university students. They ran track. They just got caught up in this. And so if you think about making, did she make a bad decision to date this guy? I don't think she did. He was a good guy who came from a good family, who was going to be a doctor for all she knew. And, that was certainly the image that he was portraying to the world at that time.
Do you know if they've had any contact since Will's been in jail?
They did have some contact in the very early days, but no, not beyond that. She seems to have removed herself from the situation relatively quickly. Again, I have not had the chance to talk with her directly, but I can gather this from her testimony.
So he's eligible for parole, right? In 5 years?
In 5 years, 2030.
And you essentially said he's an excellent inmate. He's educated himself. He's done all the right things, except for show remorse to the family.
That's right. I mean, perhaps he thinks he was showing remorse when he said he hoped that his testimony would bring them relief. I asked several of Taylor Samson's family members directly if it did bring them relief, and they said no, largely because they don't believe all of the story. And I think, they all have their own individual opinions on what they believe, but a number of them said to me, we believe the skeleton of what he described, and we think he filled in the rest of it to make himself sound like less of a monster. One of them told me, those are her words. But during the sentencing, he was asked, as all convicted people are, is there anything you would like to say? And he said no. And sometimes I have seen people do take that opportunity to address the family directly. It is, though, difficult to say those things when you're still appealing everything. He's appealing the conviction of second degree as well, right? This is not over. And so, sometimes people ask me if I think that he'll talk to me. And there have been conversations about that, not between he and I directly, but between both of his legal teams for the first trial and the second trial. And both of them sort of led me to believe that there was a possibility that I would get that interview. It hasn't happened, but I also think it could not have happened at this point. How can you speak to a journalist and tell a story publicly that will be shared in a book when you are still appealing these matters before a court of law?
And I don't know if you share your opinion on it, but where does your personal belief lay here?
I don't share opinions because I'm a daily practicing journalist still. So
That's fair.
I point to the evidence and analysis.
Very good.
Well, again, amazing work covering
Thank you.
this and recovering it and just being a good, responsible spokesperson for it. What do you have going on aside from your reporting duties? Are you working on another book?
Oh, I've got lots of ideas for books, but I don't have a lot of time because I am a full-time journalist, and the nature of my job, it's incredibly demanding. And this is not a complaint, not at all. I love my job, but I don't have any control over my own time. So it's a pretty unique job insofar as when I go to work in the morning, I don't know when I'm coming home. There's no end time to my shift, because it depends on whether or not there's news that day. I only cover national news, so it has to be big enough to be of interest to the country, not just the town and city and the communities around here that I live in. So, for example, when I was writing Second Degree, actually it was the second draft, and it was coming up on the deadline, and everything was on track, and I had this schedule very well organized. I'm going to edit this many chapters each weekend because all of this work happens on my evenings, weekends, vacation. And there were wildfires in the province neighboring the province that I live in. And so for my day job, I got deployed to these wildfires, and I lost that entire weekend. So then, fortunately, I had a very understanding editor who also used to be a journalist and understands that I have no control over these things. So I don't have a lot of time to write books, but I have all kinds of ideas, and they'll happen over time. People always ask me to write more true crime books whenever there are other big cases in the region that I live in. I get a lot of, "Oh, are you going to do a book on this?" I didn't set out to be a true crime writer, right? I was just in the right place at the right time to be the person to tell this story. I was really the only person who could write this book. I was there, as I said, in the first days when his family thought he was missing. I did the first exclusive interview with his mother. I was at the farm when they were searching the farm for evidence. I attended the first trial and the bail hearing, and all the trial, I always say, is the big show for the public at the end, right? There are years of in between and months of pretrial negotiations. Again, all of that is under a publication ban while it was happening. But I was there taking all of these notes, and now all of that is contained in this book. So I just wound up in this situation where I became a true crime writer. So my other ideas are not necessarily true crime, and none of them are formulated enough where I can really share details of them, but I think people will be surprised, and certainly people who know my work will be surprised that probably the next thing I'm going to do is going to be a children's book. So it's really quite far from this, but well, I'm busy.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us here
Thank you for having
on the
me.
podcast. Yeah, we appreciate your time and story. It's quite fascinating.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Lance. Thanks for your interest.
Okay, we're back here for final thoughts after the conversation with Kayla Hounsell. Lance, she was a great guest. That story is so interesting, and there is still some unknowns there, which I find kind of frustrating.
I know, given the fact that there's some CCTV security footage and actual witnesses to what seems to be mere minutes after the murder took place, it's just kind of hard to wrap your head around the timing on that. Like, these individuals, they were so close to seeing exactly what happened, which would have answered so many questions. Like, it would have answered all of the questions, but for whatever reason the universe provided, they showed up just minutes after, only to see Mr. Sandeson's reaction to this murder, which I kept getting hung up on, and I still am. And Kayla did a great job laying all of this out, but William Sandeson seemed to have a future. He seemed to have a promising future that a lot of people would be not envious of, but would be willing to sacrifice something to be in his position, to be going to medical school, even if there is student debt. I mean, student debt happens. And just this, like, falling of dominoes. You see that you can make quick money dealing a couple of, I don't deal weed, but
You don't?
and then, I made quick money. What if it was more? I can make even more money. I can see how one could get caught up in all of that. But tough to wrap my head around not going with the alternative, which is go to school, get your education, and work out your payment plan with your student loans.
So he's in prison now, but he's got about 5 more years, I think Kayla said, before he can potentially be paroled. So, and he's educating himself in prison. So he may still have, I don't know, a decent job or something like that when he gets out. I don't know. I mean, it's so strange to me how this story unfolded, and I will add my even though I understand why Kayla doesn't share her opinion, I will share mine. I think there's something wrong here. I think first degree was maybe more appropriate than second degree to me. But again, the differences here in America's legal system and Canada's legal system is, Sanderson has a chance to get out in like 5 years. And he's doing the things that he should be doing to get out. So, like you said earlier, this was a smart kid with a bright future. He's a smart prisoner with potentially a bright future now, which is weird to think.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. He's smart enough to figure out all of the ways where he can get out once his parole is eligible, and he's already served. I think he's already served 5 years, so he does have 5 years left. And Canada doesn't do life in prison in the sense that we do life in prison, where they're literally in prison for the rest of their life. So he's doing everything that he needs to do to earn degrees, get as much knowledge as he can, educate himself, be a model prisoner. And I thought it was interesting where Kayla said basically he hasn't shown proper remorse to the family other than a brief moment in court where it just didn't seem to be enough. So if he does show proper remorse, even if it's not genuine, even if he fakes it, starts crying and says, man, I can't even, I don't know where my head was at, he probably will get paroled. He probably will be back out. And I don't think he's going to turn into a repeat offender, because this seemed to be a situation that got out of control. And I almost suggested it, but I didn't want to put Kayla in the position where she had to say yes or no to a particular opinion, but it seemed like it probably might have been an accident where he was threatening the guy, put a gun to his head, and maybe accidentally pulled the trigger just out of adrenaline or something, because it seemed to happen like too fast with Taylor going into the room.
I don't know.
And there wasn't a whole lot of time. But anyway, it was just a thought that was going through my head, leading back to my original point of like, I don't think he's going to be a repeat offender. I don't think this was like something that, he plans on. It didn't succeed for him. He got caught. He couldn't cover it up well enough. He got caught and he's in prison. And I wonder what'll happen. I don't know how it works in Canada. We can certainly find out from our Canadian counterparts, but I don't know how it works in Canada, where someone who's been convicted and served time for murder, second-degree murder, are they going to be allowed to work in a hospital? If he comes out of there with a medical degree, can he go, I don't know, be a pharmacist or any sort of technician in a hospital?
Yeah, I guess as long as he gets hired, as long as someone's, I guess, open-minded enough to believe that he was not, it wasn't like, first-degree malicious murder.
Yeah, right, because it's not like he killed his girlfriend in a jealous rage. I'm not saying either one is worse or better, but this seems more like something where he can explain, listen, the situation was out of my control. I was in over my head. This is not who I am. I made a horrible, horrible mistake, and now I'm out. But while I was being rehabilitated, I did my best to be rehabilitated and educate myself. So if he's properly qualified for a good job and they can oversee the conviction, yeah, you're right. He might just come out of this and in 15 years from now might be on the path that he was originally supposed to be on, or a version thereof.
It is just so weird. Like, I kind of feel like we'll never know the truth about exactly what happened, even though there was the witness, and then there were the two other, partial witnesses, at least, I guess. Yeah, it's just such a weird story. And we covered a case recently about a missing young woman from Bloomington, Indiana, named Lauren Spearer. And we had an interview with author Sean Cohen, who wrote a great book called College Girl Missing. And that episode just came out like a month ago or a few weeks ago or something. And it's easy for me to make the comparisons in those cases because that episode came out so recently, and we spoke with Kayla right after, because you're talking about a college student who enters like an apartment or a townhouse, something happens, or in the case of Sandeson and Samson, something definitely happened. In Spear's case, we think something may have happened, but everything changes. In the Spear case, no one talks, no one's in prison. And in the other case, in Canada, he eventually talks, even though he has contradictory stories and he's given several versions. He's in prison now.
The circumstances lead more to an answer that involves Sandeson more than in Lauren Spear's case, where the circumstances leave a lot more room for possibilities. Or what's the term?
Reasonable doubt?
Yes. There's more reasonable doubt there. Thank you, counselor. There's more reasonable doubt because a witness or a potential suspect can simply say, you can't prove that she didn't leave here, and immediately get picked up by somebody. In this case, he's dead. There's witnesses saying that person was in the chair. There was blood coming out of his head, and we saw William frantically running, like moving around the apartment. And in both cases, there's no body, which is another similarity. And in Sandeson's case, Samson's body is supposedly somewhere in the Bay of Fundy, which has, as Kayla described, these tides that are pretty intense. So his body might never be recovered. But the DNA was found in the bag, which apparently wasn't even really big enough to put the body in, which is that might lead to some sort of condition when we're talking about him being paroled. I mean,
Right.
the cover-up might be as important in determining whether or not he's going to be a career criminal. If you have the mental fortitude to dismember a body after accidentally or purposely killing them, I think there's something that's gone to another place, right?
Yeah, but this is all too confusing because I don't believe that he was in that bag. And I don't believe that he was dismembered in that apartment in those hours. Like I know there's DNA in the bag, but I don't know that he would have fit in the bag.
Apparently he was over 6 feet tall. The bag was like a basic
6'5".
Yeah. 6'5".
Yeah. So I don't know. Like some of this story, again, it's frustrating to kind of suss out because I feel like we're never going to get answers. And also the whole thing about that sparked the argument in the beginning about the home invasion, like that makes no sense to me. Like why Sandeson would assume Taylor Samson did it or something and get violent about it. I don't understand that at all.
Yeah, that very confusing, very confusing. But hey, kids, don't do drugs.
Yeah. I mean, don't deal drugs.
Don't deal drugs. Do as much as you want, but don't deal them.
Yeah. One last thing. I also found it interesting when we were talking about Sandeson's girlfriend at the time of the murder, because she was with him before he murdered Taylor and after, just not during. And I just thought that was interesting, like how she approaches that. Like, how does she feel about him now? I, wanted to ask, but I didn't want it to be, laughed at, but like, are they still together? And I know they're not. I know they're not now, because of the questions we asked, but I didn't at the time. I didn't read the book. Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast gave us Kayla's contact info to interview her because her book is, out and she's got such an interesting story, but we didn't have time to read the book. So we were kind of working our way through the story as we spoke with her. So yeah, it was definitely interesting part of the conversation.
And they had been dating for just over a year, she said?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, just over a year. I don't know. I think back to my relationship, and I think I knew my significant other enough after a year or so where we would be comfortable with certain topics. I think over a year is like enough time. But I could never imagine saying to her, I've been doing this drug dealing thing to make some extra cash. And her reaction being, well, just do it when I'm not around because I'm not comfortable with it. It would probably be something along the lines of, you understand how dangerous this is. I don't want to be a part of it. You need to stop doing it. It's illegal. And I'm not certainly blaming anybody. I mean, I'm also referencing a relationship that I'm currently in, and, I'm obviously in my 60s, so we have a little bit more life lessons. So I guess in your early 20s, you tend to not make those. It's easy for somebody in my age group and, to look at a situation for, these kids we're in and say that was a bad choice.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and this episode. Check out the book, Second Degree. There are links in the show notes. Thanks a lot for listening.